Most people assume that by the time the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Germans were already scrambling to respond. What they don't realize is that 3 days after the invasion began, the most important message of the entire operation was still being written. And it wasn't sent by a general. It came from a man the Germans trusted more than almost anyone else in their intelligence network. His name was Juan Pujol García. The British called him Garbo, and by the time the war ended, he had managed something that still feels almost impossible when you look at it closely. He convinced the German High Command that the real invasion of Europe hadn't happened yet. The story of how he did it starts years earlier, and it's not the kind of story that begins with some dramatic recruitment in a smoky room. It begins with rejection. In 1941, Juan Pujol was living in Madrid. He was a Spaniard who had already decided he hated both fascism and communism. He approached the British embassy and offered to work as a spy against the Germans. They turned him down. He tried again. They turned him down again. Eventually, he stopped asking nicely and decided to approach the Germans instead, not because he wanted to help them, but because he figured if he could get inside their system, he could feed them bad information. Think about that for a moment. Here was a man trying to do the right thing by offering his services to the British, and they rejected him twice. How many people would have just given up after that? But Pujol didn't. Instead, he made a calculated decision to approach the enemy. Do you think his willingness to work with the Germans, even with the intention to deceive them, was a sign of his commitment? Or does it suggest something about how desperate he was becoming? The Germans accepted him. They gave him the code name Arabelle and sent him to Britain to set up a spy network. There was only one problem. He never went to Britain. He stayed in Lisbon, Portugal, and started making things up. At first, this sounds reckless. How do you invent intelligence reports about a country you've never set foot in? But Pujol was careful. He studied British newspapers, train schedules, and even the society pages. He created a network of imaginary sub-agents. Some were Welsh nationalists, some were disgruntled soldiers, some were civil servants with money problems. None of them existed, and yet the Germans believed every report he sent. The audacity of this is worth sitting with for a moment. Pujol wasn't just lying to the Germans, he was constructing an entire alternate reality, complete with backstories, fictional networks, and invented sources. He was essentially writing a novel and submitting it as fact to one of the most ruthless intelligence services in the world. One mistake, one inconsistency, one detail that didn't hold up under scrutiny, and he would have been caught. By early 1942, British intelligence finally realized something strange was happening. They noticed that someone was sending the Germans remarkably detailed information that was consistently wrong in very specific ways. They investigated and eventually tracked it back to Pujol. Instead of arresting him, they brought him to London and gave him the code name Garbo. Now he was working for both sides at the same time, but only one side knew it. When the British discovered Pujol, they had a choice. They could have prosecuted him as a double agent, or they could turn him into an asset. The fact that they chose to recruit him suggests they recognized something valuable in him. What do you think they saw? Was it his intelligence, his nerve, or something else entirely? This is where the story becomes less about courage and more about patience, because the real work wasn't in the dramatic moments, it was in the slow, careful construction of trust. Over the next 2 years, Garbo sent hundreds of messages to the Germans. He built up his fictional network until it included 27 sub-agents. Some of them even died over time, which only made the surviving ones seem more credible. The Germans started depending on him. They gave him the Iron Cross for his service. They genuinely believed he was one of their most valuable assets in Britain. Think about what this meant. The German intelligence service had a decorated spy working inside Britain, a man they trusted completely, a man whose information had proven reliable time and time again. That's not a small thing. That's the foundation of an entire intelligence operation. Then came the spring of 1944. The Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Everyone knew it was coming. The question was where. The Germans expected it to happen at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. That's where they concentrated their strongest forces, including the 15th Army, one of their most powerful formations. The Allies needed the Germans to keep believing that, so they created Operation Fortitude. and Garbo became central to it. In the weeks before D-Day, he sent a steady stream of messages suggesting that the main invasion force was still in southeast England, waiting to cross at Pas de Calais. He reported troop movements that didn't exist. He described units that were nowhere near the real embarkation points. The Germans ate it up. They were getting confirmation of what they already believed to be true. Here's something worth considering. The Germans didn't just believe Pujol's reports because he had been right in the past. They believed him because he was telling them what they expected to hear. If Pujol had sent a message saying the invasion would happen in Normandy, would the Germans have believed him? Or would they have dismissed it because it contradicted what they already thought? Then, on June 6th, the Allies landed in Normandy. For the first 72 hours, the German response was confused but not catastrophic. They still weren't sure if Normandy was the main event or just a diversion. This was the moment everything could have fallen apart. If the Germans had moved the 15th Army south immediately, they might have been able to contain the beachhead before it grew too strong. The Allies had achieved surprise tactically, but strategically, they were still vulnerable. The Germans had enough troops. They had enough material. What they didn't have was certainty about where the real attack was coming, and that uncertainty was the only advantage the Allies had. On June 9th, Garbo sent his most important message yet. He told the Germans that the Normandy landings were a feint. The real invasion, he said, was still coming at Pas de Calais. He claimed to have information from his network that several large formations were still in Britain and preparing to cross. He even expressed frustration that the Germans hadn't taken his earlier warnings more seriously. The message was carefully constructed. It was long. It was detailed. And it was exactly what the Germans wanted to hear. They believed him. Hitler ordered that the 15th Army remain in place. For weeks after the Normandy landings had already succeeded, some of Germany's best troops stayed exactly where they were, waiting for an invasion that was never going to come. By the time they finally realized the truth, it was too late to change the outcome. If you had been a German general receiving this intelligence on June 9, 1944, how would you have weighed it against what you were seeing with your own eyes? Your troops were already fighting in Normandy. You had reports from your field commanders about the intensity of the battle, yet your most trusted intelligence source was telling you this wasn't the main event. Would you have trusted the intelligence or your own commanders in the field? What makes this story unsettling isn't just that one man managed to influence Hitler's decisions. It's how completely the Germans trusted him even after the invasion had begun. They didn't question whether their star agent might be compromised. They assumed their intelligence was correct and that the Allies were simply being clever. There's a psychology at work here that goes beyond simple naivety. Once you've built a system around a particular assumption, once you've positioned your forces based on that assumption, it becomes incredibly difficult to admit that the assumption was wrong. The cost of being wrong is too high, so instead, you find ways to reinterpret the new information to fit the old belief. The Germans didn't say, "Our agent is lying to us." They said, "This is exactly what we expected." The Allies are conducting a diversionary assault while preparing the main invasion elsewhere. They made the evidence fit the theory rather than changing the theory based on the evidence. I sometimes wonder what that level of certainty feels like. When you've built an entire system around believing one source, how hard is it to accept that the source might be lying to you? Have you ever been in a situation where you trusted someone's information completely, only to later discover you'd been wrong about your trust? What made you continue believing them even when there might have been reason to doubt? Garbo survived the war. The British gave him the Member of the British Empire. The Germans had already given him the Iron Cross. He remains the only person in history to receive decorations from both sides for the same operation. After the war, he disappeared into civilian life in Venezuela and later the United States. He didn't seek attention. Most people didn't even know his name until historians started digging into the declassified files decades later. This is one of the things that fascinates me about him. He didn't do this for glory. He didn't do it for money, though he was certainly paid. He did it because he had decided at some fundamental level that fascism was wrong and that he could do something about it from inside the system. He spent years of his life living under an assumed identity, sending messages that he knew could get him executed if discovered, all with the knowledge that he might never be recognized for what he had actually accomplished. The part that stays with me is how ordinary the whole thing felt from his perspective. He wasn't some larger-than-life figure. He wasn't commandeering operations or making dramatic last stands. He was a man who kept showing up, kept writing messages, and kept being careful. The drama only existed on the German side, in the rooms where his reports were being read and believed. If you had been in one of those German intelligence meetings in early June 1944, would you have questioned the source that had been right so many times before? Or would you have done exactly what they did, assumed that previous success meant continued reliability? There's a lesson in Garbo's operation that goes beyond World War II. It's about how institutions handle information, how they verify sources, and how they adapt when reality doesn't match their expectations. The Germans had multiple intelligence sources. They had aerial reconnaissance, they had agents scattered throughout Britain, they had radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations, but when all of those sources pointed in one direction and their most trusted agent confirmed it, they didn't question the consensus, they reinforced it. Looking at how intelligence organizations work today, do you think we've actually learned the lessons from operations like Garbo? Or do institutions still tend to trust established sources even when new information suggests they might be wrong? Garbo never fired a shot. He never led troops. He never commanded armies or made strategic decisions. He just kept sending messages until the people on the other end couldn't afford to stop believing them. And that turned out to be enough. The 15th Army stayed in place for weeks. Those weeks mattered. They mattered more than any single battle. Because what Garbo had done was buy time. He had given the Allies the space they needed to consolidate the beachhead, bring in supplies, build up forces, and turn the foothold into something the Germans couldn't eliminate. By the time the Germans finally realized the truth and started moving the 15th Army south, it was no longer a question of whether they could push the Allies back into the sea. It was only a question of how far they could push them before they ran out of the strength to try. When historians look at D-Day and its aftermath, they often focus on the brilliant tactical execution of the landings themselves. But do you think the intelligence war that preceded it, the deception, the misdirection, the carefully constructed lie, was just as important to the outcome? Why or why not? The thing about deception at that scale is that it doesn't work in a vacuum. Garbo's messages would have meant nothing if the Allies hadn't also conducted Operation Fortitude, the massive physical deception campaign that included dummy armies, false radio traffic, and real troop movements designed to suggest the invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais. It would have meant nothing if the Germans hadn't already believed that Pas-de-Calais was the logical place to invade. Garbo succeeded because his message fit into a larger narrative that the Germans had already constructed for themselves. He was the confirmation that made the Germans feel smart. He was the source that told them they had been right all along. That's the real power of what he did. He didn't invent a new belief. He reinforced an existing one. He gave the Germans permission to believe what they already wanted to believe. After the war, Pujol faded from history. Fewer people know his name than know the names of many military commanders who were far less consequential to the outcome of the war. The Allies kept his operation classified for decades. When it was finally declassified, it didn't generate the same level of interest as the Enigma break or the Manhattan Project penetration. But if you trace the line from June 9, 1944, forward, you can see his fingerprints on the entire rest of the war in Western Europe. Every day that the 15th Army didn't move south was a day that the Allies could consolidate, reinforce, and prepare for the breakout from Normandy. Every week that the Germans waited for the invasion at Pas-de-Calais was a week that the Allies could train fresh troops, stockpile ammunition, and prepare for the liberation of France. Garbo's message didn't win the war by itself, but it was one of the pieces that made victory possible. And that's often what espionage actually is. Not dramatic cloak-and-dagger stuff, but small advantages that accumulate over time. If you had to rank the factors that made D-Day successful, the initial surprise, the air superiority, the industrial capacity of the Allies, the intelligence deception, where would you place the intelligence operation itself? What's your reasoning? The uncomfortable part of this story, the part that doesn't have a clean answer, is about how willing people are to believe what they already want to be true, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of them. The Germans weren't stupid, their intelligence analysts weren't incompetent, they were people operating with incomplete information, making decisions based on what they thought they knew, and trusting sources that had proven reliable in the past, and they were wrong. We like to think that if we had been in their position, we would have seen through the deception. We would have questioned the source. We would have recognized the lie. But history is full of examples of very intelligent, very capable people making exactly the mistakes the Germans made. They trusted what they had decided was true. They dismissed evidence that contradicted their assumptions. They reinforced their own biases with every decision they made. Garbo understood this about human nature. He knew that the best lie is one that tells people what they already believe. He knew that intelligence analysis, no matter how rigorous, is always shaped by what the analyst expects to find, and he exploited that knowledge with remarkable precision. When you step back from the drama of it all, that's what makes his operation so remarkable. It wasn't about fooling the Germans with a clever trick. It was about understanding how they thought, what they believed, and what they needed to hear to continue believing it. It was about recognizing that the human mind is far more vulnerable to a well-placed confirmation than it is to an outright lie. Garbo died in 1988 in obscurity. Most of the world never knew his name. The Germans he deceived either died in the war or spent decades after it wondering how they could have been so completely wrong about something that seemed so obviously right at the time. If you had been sitting in that intelligence briefing, if you had been the general or the analyst who received Garbo's message on June 9, 1944, would you have done anything differently? Or would you have done exactly what they did? That's the question that haunts this story. And I think the honest answer for most of us is that we don't know. We like to believe we would have been smarter, more careful, more skeptical. But we also all have our own Garbos, sources we trust, assumptions we built our plans around, beliefs that feel so solid we couldn't imagine them being wrong. The difference between Pujol and the rest of us is that he recognized that vulnerability and turned it into a weapon. He didn't just lie. He lied in a way that made his targets feel intelligent for believing him. He gave them exactly the narrative they needed to continue making the decisions he wanted them to make. That's espionage at its finest. Not the dramatic stuff, the patient, careful, methodical work of understanding people well enough to predict what they'll do with the information you give them. Garbo never fired a shot. He never led troops. He just kept sending messages until the people on the other end couldn't afford to stop believing them. And that turned out to be enough to change the course of a war.